Picture this. You are 14 years old, standing in the Hall of the Vestal Virgins in Rome, 218 Anno Domini. The marble beneath your bare feet is cold enough to make your toes curl, but you are not allowed to flinch. Not today. Not when senators in purple-trimmed togas line the walls like statues, their eyes fixed on you with expressions that shift between disgust and fascination. The air is thick with frankincense, but beneath it, you smell something else. Fear. Yours perhaps, or theirs. Your body is still a boy's body. Narrow shoulders, smooth chest, hips that haven't widened into the masculine strength Rome expects of its emperors. But you wear women's silk today. The fabric clings to your skin, dyed the deep purple reserved for royalty, embroidered with golden thread that catches the lamplight like captured stars. Your face has been painted. White lead powder smooths your complexion. Coal dust darkens your eyes. Rouge stains your cheeks and lips the color of pomegranate seeds crushed on stone. You can feel the makeup beginning to run in the heat. Sweat traces lines down your temples despite the coolness of the marble palace. Your heart hammers against your ribs so hard you wonder if the senators can see it through the silk. The woman approaching you is twice your age, maybe more. Her gown is golden, shimmering like sunlight on water, and her hair is piled high in elaborate curls held in place with jeweled pins worth more than most Romans will see in their lifetimes. Her eyes are dark, obsidian dark, the kind of darkness that swallows light rather than reflecting it. You have known those eyes your entire life. She is your mother, or perhaps your aunt, or maybe your grandmother's daughter by a lover whose name no one speaks aloud. The bloodline is tangled like rope left too long in seawater, and no one is quite certain anymore where one generation ends and another begins. What everyone knows, what they whisper in the taverns and bathhouses, what makes their voices drop to scandalized hushes, is that tonight she will share your bed. Not as advisor, not as regent, as wife. The high priest of the sun god begins the ceremony in Aramaic, a language most senators don't understand. But you do. You were raised in the temple at Emesa, trained since childhood to serve the black stone that fell from heaven, the meteorite that represents Elagabalus, the god of the mountain. Your Latin is still halting, your Greek barely functional, but the ancient languages of the East flow from your tongue like honey. Your bride steps closer. Her perfume overwhelms the incense, myrrh and something darker, something that reminds you of the private chambers where she would sit beside you when you were small, her hand on your thigh, teaching you the secret ways of power that have nothing to do with armies or laws. The priest asks a question. You answer. Your voice cracks halfway through, betraying your youth, and several senators shift uncomfortably. One covers his mouth, another turns away entirely. Your bride, your mother, your political creation, smiles. Her lips part slightly. Her teeth are very white in the lamplight. The priest binds your hands together with golden cord, your palm pressed to hers. Her skin is warm, familiar. You have held this hand since before you could walk. But tonight, when you hold it, senators will call it perversion, abomination, the end of Rome's sacred traditions. She leans forward. Her lips brush yours. Not a mother's kiss. Something else. Something the crowd both craves and despises. The senators erupt in forced applause, the sound echoing off marble walls like thunder trapped in stone. Somewhere in that noise you hear genuine revulsion, but also arousal, curiosity. The same energy that fills the amphitheater when lions tear apart criminals, when blood soaks into sand while the crowd screams for more. You are 14 years old. You are emperor of the greatest empire the world has ever known. You command 30 legions, control territories from Britain to Egypt, can order the death of any man, woman, or child with a gesture. But in this moment, dressed in silk and cosmetics, bound to a woman whose relationship to you no one can quite define, you realize something that will haunt you for the rest of your very short life. You are not the ruler of Rome. You are its entertainment. This is not a love story. This is how gods are made and unmade. Before we dive deeper into this nightmare, if you want to learn more hidden truths about history that textbooks conveniently forget, consider hitting that like button and subscribing, and comment below to let me know where you're watching from. I find it fascinating that across 2,000 years, we're connected by our shared horror at what absolute power does to the human soul. Now, back to Rome. Let's rewind 4 years, back to when the boy who would become emperor was still just that, a boy, not even a particularly important boy, despite what his grandmother would later claim. The year is 214 Anno Domini. The Severan dynasty controls Rome, but it's beginning to fracture like old pottery left too long in the sunday. Emperor Caracalla rules through terror and military might, but he's made enemies of everyone who matters. The Senate despises him. The people fear him. Even his own soldiers are growing tired of his paranoid rages and increasingly erratic behavior. In the eastern city of Emesa, in what we now call Syria, a woman named Julia Soamius watches her 10-year-old son perform his duties in the temple of the sun god. The boy's name is Varius Avitus Bassianus, though soon the world will know him by a different name entirely, Elagabalus, named for the god he serves. Julia Soamius is not just a priestess or a minor noble. She is the daughter of Julia Maesa, sister to the former Empress Julia Domna. Syrian blood flows through their veins, mixed with Roman ambition and something else, something older. The ancient power that comes from worshipping gods Rome barely understands, deities whose rituals would make even hardened legionaries uncomfortable. The boy is beautiful, unnervingly so. His features are delicate, almost feminine. Dark hair falls to his shoulders in waves that catch the sunlight streaming through the temple windows. His eyes are enormous, framed by lashes so long they cast shadows on his cheeks. When he dances before the altar, whirling in silk robes with arms raised toward the sun, even grown men stop to stare. Julia Maesa, the grandmother, watches this and sees opportunity. She has been close to power her entire life. Her sister, Julia Domna, was empress, wife to Emperor Septimius Severus, mother to Caracalla and Geta. She knows how the game is played, how bloodlines can be manufactured, how divinity can be claimed, how a beautiful child can become a weapon more devastating than any legion. The story she begins to whisper is simple, elegant, devastating in its implications. Her grandson, this beautiful boy dancing in the temple, is not the son of Sextus Varius Marcellus, the Syrian noble officially recorded as his father. No, he is the illegitimate son of the late Emperor Caracalla himself. Julia Soamius, she claims, caught the emperor's eye during his visits to the eastern provinces. The boy is true Severan blood, divine blood, the rightful heir to the purple throne. Is it true? Probably not. The timeline doesn't quite work. The resemblance isn't that striking. But Julia Maesa understands something fundamental about power. Truth matters less than belief. And if you can convince soldiers that a boy is divinely descended, they will follow that boy into hell itself. She has something else working in her favor. Money. The Severan women control enormous fortunes, accumulated through decades of imperial proximity. Gold can buy loyalty that bloodlines merely suggest. When news arrives that Emperor Caracalla has been assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard in 217, Julia Maesa acts with terrifying speed. She begins spreading her story throughout the Eastern legions. The boy, she says, is the true emperor, divine right made flesh, and he serves a god more powerful than Jupiter himself. The soldiers of the 3rd Gallic Legion are stationed near Emesa. They're tired, underpaid, and disillusioned with the new emperor Macrinus, who lacks the charisma and divine pretensions that made the Severans so effective at maintaining loyalty. When they see the boy, this beautiful child dancing before the black stone that fell from heaven, something in their soldier hearts responds. It's not just his supposed bloodline, it's his otherworldliness, his feminine grace combined with the authority of one who speaks directly to gods. He doesn't look like other boys, doesn't move like other boys, and in an empire that worships spectacle above all else, this strangeness becomes its own form of power. Julia Maesa sweetens the deal with promises of bonuses, promotions, and the return to glory days under the Severans. She dresses the boy in imperial purple despite his youth, despite his questionable lineage, despite the fact that no one is quite certain who his father really was. The 3rd Legion declares for Elagabalus in May of 218. Other Eastern legions quickly follow. Emperor Macrinus marches to stop this rebellion, but his soldiers are half-hearted in their loyalty. When the armies meet near Antioch, Macrinus finds himself commanding men who would rather be fighting for the beautiful boy priest than for him. The battle is less a military engagement than a transfer of allegiance. Soldiers simply walk from one side to the other. Macrinus flees. He will be captured and executed shortly after. The boy becomes emperor. He is 14 years old, and when the crown was placed on his head, he was still learning how to write his own name. The journey from Emesa to Rome takes months, long enough for word to spread throughout the empire, long enough for senators to begin calculating their positions, long enough for the boy to understand that he now possesses power beyond anything he could have imagined in the temple. but not long enough for anyone to prepare for what he would do with that power. Traditional Roman emperors follow certain patterns. They wear togas, they maintain dignified bearing, they present masculine strength, they marry women of appropriate aristocratic families. They produce heirs, they pay lip service to the Senate's authority while consolidating their own. They worship Roman gods in Roman ways. Elagabalus does none of this. The first shock comes when he enters Rome in late summer of 218. Emperors typically make ceremonial entries, riding in gilded chariots, wearing military regalia that reminds everyone of their authority. Instead, Elagabalus arrives, dressed in flowing silk robes, embroidered with scenes of his sun god, defeating Roman deities. His face is painted, his hair is styled in elaborate Eastern fashion. He doesn't ride a chariot, he dances. Actually dances through the streets, spinning and whirling to music played by Syrian musicians. His arms raised toward the sky, his voice singing hymns in languages most Romans have never heard. The crowd doesn't know whether to cheer or riot. He brings the black stone with him, the meteorite from a mesa. He has it installed in a new temple on the Palatine Hill, the most sacred space in Rome, and declares it superior to Jupiter himself. The cult of Elagabal becomes the state religion. Traditional Roman ceremonies are modified or abandoned entirely, but religious innovation is nothing compared to what comes next. Elagabalus refuses to wear men's clothing for formal occasions. He commissions wardrobes of silk and linen in women's styles, dresses that flow rather than drape, colors that shimmer, jewelry that would make courtesans blush. He wears makeup daily, not just for ceremonies, for everything. Meetings with senators, military reviews, court proceedings. His hair grows longer. He learns cosmetic techniques from Eastern priestesses who serve female deities. How to line eyes with kohl, how to stain lips with crushed petals, how to use powders that soften masculine features into something ambiguous, something that disturbs Roman sensibilities precisely because it's so difficult to categorize. Roman masculinity is rigid. Men are hard, women are soft. Men command, women submit. Men conquer, women are conquered. These categories aren't just social, they're considered natural law, divine order, the foundation of civilization itself. Elagabalus dissolves them like salt in water. He begins demanding courtiers address him with feminine titles. Not emperor, empress, not Caesar, lady, not master of Rome, priestess of the sun god. The Senate is paralyzed. How do you address an emperor who insists on being called empress? How do you maintain senatorial dignity when the ruler giggles during formal proceedings? How do you take seriously military decisions made by someone wearing more jewelry than the Vestal virgins? But they quickly discover that beneath the cosmetics and silk lies real power. Elagabalus may look like a dancer, but he's backed by loyal Eastern legions, his grandmother's political genius, and enormous wealth. Cross him, and you disappear. Mock him, and your family loses its status. Refuse his edicts, and you find yourself governing some miserable outpost where malaria kills more Romans than barbarians. The marriages begin. First, he weds Julia Cornelia Paula, a respectable aristocratic girl chosen by his grandmother to provide legitimacy. The marriage lasts less than a year. Elagabalus finds her boring. He divorces her, claiming she has physical deformities, though everyone knows the truth. She was too normal, too Roman, too female in the traditional sense. His next marriage shocks even jaded Romans. He marries Aquilia Severa, a Vestal virgin. This isn't just scandalous, it's sacrilege. Vestal virgins are bound by sacred vows. Their virginity protects Rome itself. Violating a Vestal virgin is punishable by being buried alive. But Elagabalus doesn't see violation. He sees divine union. The high priest of the sun god marrying the sacred virgin of Rome. The mingling of Eastern and Western religious traditions. The creation of children who would be, literally, demigods. The Senate is horrified. The people riot. His grandmother, Julia Maessa, forces him to divorce Aquilia and marry someone safer. He complies, briefly, then divorces the safe choice and remarries Aquilia again, because no one, not even grandmother, can truly control him. But these marriages to women are almost beside the point, because Elagabalus isn't just marrying women. He takes a husband. The man's name is Heracles. He's a charioteer, blonde, muscular, everything traditionally masculine that Elagabalus is not. The emperor meets him at the circus games and becomes immediately obsessed. Within weeks, Heracles moves into the palace. Within months, Elagabalus is calling him husband and referring to himself as Hierocles' wife. This isn't metaphorical. Elagabalus stages an actual wedding ceremony. He plays the bride, wears a veil, adopts submissive postures, calls Hierocles Dominus, master. Ancient sources claim he refers to his own genitals as a disease that needs correction. Roman morality can accommodate many things. Male senators keeping teenage boys as lovers, emperors maintaining harems, sexual violence against slaves and prisoners. But what it cannot accommodate is a Roman emperor, the most powerful masculine position in the world, voluntarily adopting the receptive role, voluntarily becoming penetrated rather than penetrating. In Roman sexual ideology, power isn't about gender, it's about position. The penetrated dominates, the penetrated submits. Male citizens must always be penetrators. They can penetrate women, boys, slaves, foreigners. But they themselves must never be penetrated, because penetration equals submission, equals loss of masculine status, equals loss of citizenship itself. Elagabalus doesn't just violate this rule. He revels in violating it. He makes it public. He demands senators witness his submission to Hierocles. He giggles about it during formal functions. Ancient historians, writing decades later with undisguised contempt, claim he offers physicians enormous sums of gold to any surgeon who can transform his body, to remove his male genitalia and create something approximating female anatomy. Whether this is true or enemy propaganda is impossible to determine. But the fact that enemies believe the story tells you everything about how thoroughly he shattered Roman expectations. He doesn't just cross boundaries, he dissolves them. Senators whispered the empire now had a goddess, not a god, and that terrified them more than any barbarian invasion. But all of this, scandalous as it was, represents merely the preparation for what happened next. The event that would push even Rome's tremendous capacity for scandal past its breaking point. The year is 220. Elagabalus has been emperor for 2 years, long enough for the shock to fade slightly, long enough for Romans to begin accepting, if not approving, the emperor's eccentricities, long enough for Julia Maesa to hope that perhaps the boy will settle down, marry appropriately, produce heirs, and preserve sovereign power for another generation. She is about to be disappointed. The ceremony is announced for the calends of March, spring, the season of renewal, the time when Romans traditionally celebrate marriages, when Juno blesses unions, when families merge and dynasties continue. But this will be no traditional Roman wedding. Elagabalus commands the ceremony be conducted in the temple of his sun god. The black meteorite from Emesa presides like a silent witness. Priests in exotic eastern garments prepare incense that fills the air with smoke so thick it blurs vision, makes the marble walls seem to waver like reflections in disturbed water. The bride approaches, Julia Soaemius, the emperor's mother, or perhaps Julia Maesa, his grandmother, or maybe Julia Mamaea, his aunt. Ancient sources contradict each other on this crucial detail. Some claim it's his mother, others say a maternal relative. Some historians argue the bride is actually another Vestal virgin or Eastern priestess, and later enemies simply claimed she was his mother to make the scandal worse. But here's what makes this particular uncertainty so disturbing. It might not matter which Julia it actually was, because in the Syrian religious traditions Elagabalus followed, the high priest traditionally married the high priestess in a sacred union representing divine marriage. These unions weren't necessarily sexual in the Roman sense. They were ritual, symbolic, the joining of masculine and feminine divine principles. But Rome doesn't understand symbolic marriages. Rome sees a boy emperor in women's clothing marrying a woman who might be his own mother, and Rome sees incest. The ceremony follows Eastern patterns unfamiliar to Roman observers. The bride and groom both wear flowing robes. Both have their faces painted. Both are crowned with flowers. In the smoke and lamplight, they could be twins, reflections of each other, the blurring of categories taken to its logical conclusion. Elagabalus speaks in Aramaic throughout. His voice rises and falls in rhythms that sound like singing, like prayer, like something between human speech and divine glossolalia. The bride responds in the same language. Their hands are bound together with golden cord. Blood is drawn from both their palms and mixed in a golden bowl, then offered to the black stone. Senators sit through this like men watching an execution, frozen, horrified, unable to look away. When the ceremony ends, Elagabalus doesn't dismiss the crowd. Instead, he announces that his bride, his mother, wife priestess, will serve as co-ruler. She will attend Senate meetings. She will be granted her own household staff, her own income from the imperial treasury, her own guards. But more than this, she will serve as high priestess of the new state religion, the feminine counterpart to his masculine priesthood. Together, they will embody the divine marriage that sustains the cosmos itself. To Roman observers, this looks like incestuous megalomania. To Elagabalus, it's theological necessity. The god demands a divine couple. He is the god's priest. His mother, aunt, grandmother, whatever she is, becomes the goddess's priestess. Together, they are god and goddess made flesh. The public ceremonies that follow push scandal into territory Rome has never witnessed. Elagabalus and his bride mother priestess appear together in public, dressed identically, sometimes in men's clothing, sometimes in women's, sometimes in Eastern religious garments that defy Roman gender categories entirely. They hold hands during Senate proceedings. They sit together on thrones of equal height during court functions. Rumors begin spreading through Rome like plague. Whispers in the bathhouses, gossip in the markets, stories too obscene to write down but too delicious not to repeat. They say the emperor and his bride share a bed, not for political show, for actual sexual congress. They say priests conduct fertility rituals where both must be naked before the black stone. They say the emperor has created a new ceremony where aristocrats must witness the consummation of his marriage. They say he's trying to breed godchildren who will replace the Roman pantheon entirely. How much of this is true? How much is enemy propaganda? How much is genuine Syrian religious practice misunderstood by Romans? We will never know, but the whispers alone are enough to start fracturing imperial authority. The Praetorian Guard begins holding secret meetings. Senators start planning. Even Julia Maesa, the grandmother who engineered this entire catastrophe, realizes she's lost control of her creation. But Elagabalus doesn't notice the gathering storm. Or perhaps he doesn't care. He's too busy creating new ceremonies, new rituals, new ways of shocking Rome into submission. He commissions a golden statue of himself and his bride mother priestess. The sculpture shows them intertwined, their bodies merging, their faces identical. It's placed in the forum where traditionally only military heroes earn statues. He demands aristocratic families send their most beautiful children to serve in his temple. Boys and girls both. He dresses them identically, teaches them his Eastern dances, has them participate in ceremonies where gender becomes meaningless, where categories dissolve, where Rome's foundational assumptions about masculine and feminine, penetrator and penetrated, ruler and ruled, all collapse into ambiguity. Ancient historians claim, though this is almost certainly exaggeration, that he offers enormous rewards to any physician who can physically transform him into a woman, that he studies anatomy texts, that he consults Eastern doctors who know techniques unknown in Rome, that he wants his body to match his identity as the god's bride. Whether literally true or not, the stories spread. And in spreading, they accomplish something Rome hasn't seen in generations. They unify the Senate, the military, the people, and even his own family against him, because a boy emperor who wears silk can be tolerated. A religious innovator can be managed. A scandal can be ignored if military victories continue and grain ships keep arriving. But an emperor who marries his own mother, who dissolves the categories that make Rome possible, who wants to physically transform himself into something neither male nor female, something that shouldn't exist in the natural order, that threatens Rome at its foundation. That suggests reality itself can be reordered according to one man's desires. That implies the entire structure of power, gender, sex, family, all of it is arbitrary, changeable, subject to an individual's will rather than divine law. And when the senators begged for his removal, he laughed, because who can dethrone a god? The snow falls on Rome in early March of 222. Unseasonable, unnatural. Some see it as an omen, the gods registering their displeasure, the natural order itself rejecting what has taken root in the Palatine Palace. Elagabalus stands at a window overlooking the forum. He's 18 years old now, 4 years as emperor, 4 years of scandal, innovation, religious transformation, and increasingly desperate attempts to remake reality according to his vision. His face is still painted, his hair still elaborately styled, but something in his eyes has changed. Fear has crept in. The legions are restless. Word has reached him of mutinous talk spreading through military camps. Soldiers who cheered his arrival now speak openly of deposing him. The Third Legion, which first declared for him, has sent representatives suggesting he might want to adopt his cousin Alexianus as co-emperor. His grandmother, Julia Maessa, sits in an adjoining room, reviewing correspondence with grim expression. She knows better than anyone what's coming. She engineered one coup to place Elagabalus on the throne. She can engineer another to remove him. The boy has served his purpose, provided Severan restoration, but has now become a liability too dangerous to protect. Alexianus, soon to be renamed Alexander Severus, is everything Elagabalus is not. Masculine, dignified, boring. Exactly what Rome needs after 4 years of divine theater. Elagabalus tries to shore up his position. He elevates his closest supporters, grants enormous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, stages increasingly elaborate ceremonies designed to demonstrate his divine authority. But these gestures only accelerate the collapse. The Praetorians take his gold and begin planning his assassination. The final break comes in early spring. Elagabalus discovers the plot too late to stop it, but early enough to realize he's about to lose everything. He attempts to flee, taking with him his mother Julia Soaemius, his husband Hierocles, and a handful of loyal servants. They make it as far as the Praetorian barracks before being surrounded. The soldiers don't grant them a trial, don't allow final words, don't preserve any dignity whatsoever for the boy who once commanded their absolute obedience. They murder Elagabalus in a latrine. Let that image sink in for a moment. The high priest of the sun god, the emperor who claimed a divine descent, the boy who tried to remake Roman reality itself, killed in a place where human waste is disposed of. The symbolism is intentional, brutal. The soldiers are saying something about what they think of his reign, his innovations, his challenges to everything they consider sacred. Julia Soaemius dies beside him. Mother and son, or priestess and priest, or wife and husband, or whatever impossible relationship they actually shared, bleeding out together on dirty tiles while soldiers wipe their blades clean. But the desecration doesn't end with death. The bodies are dragged through the streets of Rome, stripped naked, displayed for public mockery. Citizens throw garbage, excrement, anything they can find. The same crowds who once watched him dance through the city in silk robes now spit on his corpse. The soldiers dump both bodies in the Tiber River. Not burial, not cremation, not even the dignity granted to executed criminals. Just disposal, as if he were trash rather than a human being who once held absolute power. Ancient sources claim his body gets caught on debris and has to be weighed down with stones to make it sink. Even in death, Rome rejects him, the river itself refusing to accept what he became. His husband Hierocles is hunted down and killed shortly after. Most of his close associates are executed. His religious innovations are immediately dismantled. The temple to Elagabalus is rededicated to Jupiter. The black meteorite is sent back to Emesa. Every statue, every inscription, every record of his reign that can be destroyed is systematically erased. The Senate issues damnatio memoriae, damnation of memory. His name is chiseled off monuments. His face is scratched out of portraits. His laws are revoked. His marriages are declared null and void. Rome attempts to pretend he never existed, that those 4 years were a collective nightmare from which they've finally awakened. Alexander Severus takes the throne. Dignified, masculine, traditional. Everything returns to normal. The categories are restored. Men are men again, women are women, emperors are emperors. The natural order reasserts itself. But even in death, his body remained too scandalous to bury. Now we need to pause and ask the question that haunts every historian who studies Elagabalus. How much of what we think we know is actually true? Because here's the uncomfortable reality. Almost everything we know about Elagabalus comes from sources written by his enemies decades after his death. Cassius Dio, writing a generation later under Alexander Severus, had every incentive to portray the previous emperor as a monstrous pervert whose removal was necessary and just. The Historia Augusta, compiled centuries later, includes such obvious fabrications and contradictions that historians treat it as partially fictional. These sources needed Elagabalus to be a monster, needed him to have committed incest, sexually abused minors, violated every sacred tradition. Because if he was merely an unconventional emperor with different religious beliefs and non-traditional gender expression, then his murder becomes less justified. Becomes, in fact, a political assassination dressed up as moral necessity. Some modern historians argue we're looking at a transgender woman 2,000 years before that concept existed. someone whose internal sense of gender didn't match their body, who tried desperately to make external reality match internal truth, and who was murdered for it. Others suggest he was a pawn in his grandmother's political games, pushed into increasingly extreme behaviors by advisors with their own agendas, unable to distinguish authentic self from performance. Still, others point to the Syrian religious traditions he followed, arguing that what looked like perversion to Romans was actually legitimate religious practice from a different cultural context. That the divine marriage, the priestly roles, the gender ambiguity, all of it made perfect sense within Syrian theology, even if Rome found it incomprehensible. The marriage to his mother figure might not have been sexual at all. It might have been ritual, symbolic, the kind of sacred partnership that dozens of ancient religions practiced without scandal. The fact that Romans interpreted it as incest tells us more about Roman assumptions than about what actually happened in that temple. The desire to physically change his body might not have been about literally becoming female. It might have been about embodying divine androgyny. Plenty of ancient deities were portrayed as combining masculine and feminine characteristics. Plenty of priests underwent ritual modifications to their bodies as acts of devotion. Or maybe all the scandalous details are true. Maybe he really did marry his mother. Maybe he really did commit acts Rome found depraved. Maybe he was genuinely mad, broken by power granted too young, twisted by a grandmother who treated him as a political tool rather than a human being. We will never know. The real Elagabalus is lost beneath layers of propaganda, misunderstanding, cultural difference, and deliberate erasure. But here's what we do know. Rome murdered a teenager for challenging their fundamental assumptions about gender, power, and divinity. They killed him in a latrine, dragged his body through streets, threw him in a river, and then spent centuries painting him as the worst emperor who ever lived. Does it matter when the myth is stronger than the man? Let's zoom out. Let's see this story for what it really is. Elagabalus wasn't just an emperor. He was a mirror held up to Roman society, and what Rome saw reflected back was too disturbing to tolerate. For generations, Rome had built its entire identity on rigid categories: citizen and slave, man and woman, Roman and barbarian, penetrator and penetrated. These weren't just social distinctions, they were cosmic principles, divine law made manifest in human society. Rome conquered because Romans knew who they were: masculine, disciplined, orderly, rational. Everything Roman virtue opposed was feminine, chaotic, disorderly, emotional. The empire's stability depended on maintaining these boundaries absolutely. Then came a boy emperor who dissolved every boundary he touched, who wore women's clothing and demanded to be called empress, who married men and women interchangeably, who might have married his own mother, who wanted to physically transform his body into something neither male nor female, who worshipped a foreign god, who performed dances in public, who made spectacle of submission rather than domination. Elagabalus didn't just violate Roman norms, he suggested those norms were arbitrary, changeable, subject to individual choice rather than natural law. And that was intolerable. Because if gender is changeable, then masculine authority loses its foundation. If the emperor can be penetrated rather than penetrating, then the entire pyramid of power collapses. If a boy can become a goddess, then maybe slaves can become citizens. Maybe women can command legions. Maybe barbarians are just as Roman as senators. The entire structure becomes questionable, fluid, subject to negotiation. Rome couldn't allow that, so Rome killed him. But here's the thing about mirrors. You can shatter them, but the reflection doesn't disappear. It just fragments into 1,000 pieces, each showing the same truth from slightly different angles. Elagabalus died at 18. His body was desecrated, his memory damned, his innovations erased. Alexander Severus restored traditional order. Everything went back to normal. Except it didn't. Not really. Because Rome never forgot him, couldn't forget him. His name became a cautionary tale whispered for centuries. Look what happens when you violate natural order. Look what happens when you challenge divine law. Look what happens when you make your own body into a battleground for reimagining reality itself. 2,000 years later, we're still telling his story. Still trying to understand what he was, still arguing about whether he was monster or victim, madman or martyr, pervert or prophet. Maybe the most honest answer is he was a child given absolute power before he understood what power meant. A child taught by his grandmother that bloodlines could be manufactured, and divinity could be claimed. A child raised in Syrian temples where gods were neither fully male nor fully female. A child who believed the empire's body could be transformed, just like his own. He was 14 when they crowned him, 18 when they murdered him. 4 years. That's all it took for absolute power to destroy a boy who might have been a genius, or might have been mad, or might have simply been different in ways Rome couldn't accommodate. Rome didn't care who ruled, so long as the games continued, so long as grain ships arrived, so long as the categories remained stable. But when the boy turned the empire's body into his own, when he made his own flesh into political statement, when he suggested that perhaps masculine and feminine, penetrator and penetrated, ruler and ruled, all of it was just performance, just costume, just silk that could be removed. Rome revolted. He wasn't a ruler, he was a mirror, and what Rome saw was too disturbing to let live. So they killed him in a latrine, threw his body in the river, and spent 2,000 years calling him the worst emperor who ever lived. But here we are, still talking about him, still trying to understand him, still haunted by the beautiful boy in silk robes who danced through Rome believing he could remake reality itself. Maybe he failed. Maybe he was always going to fail. Maybe no one, not even an emperor with 30 legions at his command, can truly challenge the categories that hold civilization together without being destroyed in the process. Or maybe he succeeded in ways Rome never intended, because every time we tell his story, every time we question whether the ancient sources were propaganda, every time we wonder if he was transgender or gender non-conforming, or simply expressing Syrian religious traditions Rome couldn't comprehend, we're doing exactly what he did. We're questioning the categories, asking whether masculine and feminine are as fixed as we've been told, wondering whether the boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable, normal and deviant, natural and unnatural, are as solid as they appear. Recognizing that sometimes the monsters in our history books were simply people who threatened to reveal that the emperor has no clothes. That power is performance. That gender is costume. That divinity is whatever we decide to worship. That reality itself is more fluid than the authorities want us to believe. Elagabalus stood in the temple of his sun god, dressed in silk and jewels, and declared himself both priest and priestess, both emperor and empress, both male and female, both human and divine. Rome killed him for it, but they couldn't kill the question he embodied. What if we're wrong about everything we think is natural? That question survives, fragments into 1,000 pieces, reflects back at us across 2 millennia. The boy who married his mother, who took a husband while ruling as emperor, who might have begged surgeons to transform his body, who danced through Rome in women's clothing while commanding the greatest military force on earth, who died in a latrine at 18 with his mother beside him, bleeding out together in filth and humiliation. His name was Varius Avitus Bassianus, or Elagabalus, or Empress, or Goddess, or whatever he was trying to become before Rome decided he had gone too far. We'll never know his truth, only Rome's version of it, only the story his enemies told to justify what they did to a teenage boy whose only real crime was believing he could be something Rome had no word for. But perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the fact that we're still arguing about him, still trying to understand him, still haunted by his impossible existence, means he won after all. Not by surviving, by becoming unforgettable. The empire tried to erase him, failed completely. Because you can't erase a question once it's been asked. You can only decide whether you're brave enough to answer it honestly. Who gets to define what's natural? Who decides where the boundaries are? Who determines what bodies can be? What genders can mean? What power can look like? Who writes the rules? And why should we believe them? Elagabalus asked these questions with his body, his clothing, his marriages, his ceremonies, his entire brief reign. Rome answered by throwing him in the river. 2,000 years later, we're still asking the same questions, still getting the same violent answers, still learning that challenging categories is the most dangerous thing a person can do, still discovering that sometimes the monsters in history books are just people who dared to be themselves in empires that demanded conformity. The boy in the latrine, the goddess in the river, the emperor who was also an empress, the son who married his mother, the husband who called himself wife, the priest who became priestess, the beautiful dancer in silk robes who believed, for 4 impossible years, that he could remake Rome in his own ambiguous image. He failed, but his failure echoes across time, and maybe that's the closest thing to immortality any of us can hope for. Not being remembered correctly, just being remembered at all. Being the question that won't die, the reflection that won't fade, the truth that keeps fragmenting into new patterns, new possibilities, new ways of understanding what it means to be human in empires that insist humanity comes in only two forms. Elagabalus was neither, or both, or something else entirely. Rome killed him for it. But here we are, still saying his name, still telling his story, still wondering what he really was beneath the propaganda and scandal and carefully constructed enemy narratives. Still haunted by a boy who died 2,000 years ago because he dared to suggest that maybe, just maybe, the categories we build our civilizations on are nothing more than silk and cosmetics and performance. Beautiful, fragile, and completely, utterly removable. If you're willing to pay the price. He paid it in full, in a latrine, at 18, with his mother beside him, and the river carried his body away but couldn't wash away the question he embodied. What if everything we believe about gender, power, identity, and reality itself is just a story we tell ourselves? A costume we wear, a boundary we maintain through violence against anyone who dares to cross it? Elagabalus crossed every boundary Rome had. They murdered him for it. But 2,000 years later, we're still talking about the boy in silk robes who married his mother and called himself empress and died, believing he was divine. Maybe he was right. Maybe we're all divine, all capable of being more than the categories assigned to us, all containing multitudes that empires find too threatening to tolerate. Maybe that's why his story still matters. Not because he was uniquely monstrous or uniquely enlightened, but because he was uniquely honest about the performance we're all engaged in, about the costumes we all wear, about the boundaries we all police in ourselves and each other because we're terrified of what happens when they dissolve. He showed Rome what lies beneath the imperial purple and the senatorial toga and the rigid categories of masculine and feminine. Nothing, everything, possibility, terror, the void where certainty used to be. And Rome, like all empires, chose violence over uncertainty, through the mirror in the river. But here we are, still looking at the reflection, still seeing fragments of ourselves in a boy who died before he could grow into whatever he was becoming, still asking his questions, still afraid of the answers. The boy king who married his mother, the emperor who became empress, the god who wanted to be goddess. The mirror Rome shattered because the reflection was too true to bear. His name was Elagabalus. Remember him, not as a monster, not as a saint, but as a question that refuses to die. As proof that some truths are more dangerous than armies, some identities more threatening than barbarian hordes, some individuals more revolutionary than political upheaval, because they dare to suggest that the foundation everything rests on is just sand and silk and paint. Beautiful, fragile, easily washed away. If you're willing to look closely enough, if you're brave enough to see what lies beneath, if you're honest enough to admit that maybe, just maybe, the categories we kill to defend are nothing more than costumes we agreed to wear. He took his off, wore silk instead of armor, called himself empress instead of emperor, married his mother and his husband and his goddess and his god, and Rome threw him in the river for it. But the river only carries away the body. The question remains, floating in the water, fragmenting in the light, reflecting in every surface we're too afraid to look at directly. Who are we beneath the costumes? What are we without the categories? Who decided what's natural, and why did we believe them? Elagabalus asked with his life. Rome answered with his death. The conversation continues. Across 2,000 years, in every person who doesn't fit the boxes, in every body that refuses the boundaries, in every soul that knows itself to be something the empire has no name for. He died at 18, in a latrine, beside his mother, murdered for being himself. But his ghost walks through history, dressed in silk, painted and jeweled, dancing and spinning, laughing at the senators who thought they could kill a question by murdering the person who asked it. You can't kill questions, you can only kill the questioners. And even that doesn't work, because here we are, still asking, still wondering, still haunted by the beautiful boy who became empress, who married his mother, who dissolved every boundary Rome built, who died believing he was divine. Maybe he was, maybe we all are. Maybe that's what empires fear most. Not barbarians at the gates, not economic collapse, not military defeat, but the realization that the categories they enforce through violence are arbitrary, changeable, subject to individual will rather than cosmic law. That masculine and feminine are performances, That power is costume. That reality itself is negotiable. That a boy can become a goddess if he wants it badly enough, even if Rome throws him in the river for it, even if his name becomes a curse for 2,000 years, even if history remembers him as the worst emperor who ever lived. He still asks the question, and we're still here, 2 millennia later, trying to answer it. That's immortality, not being loved, not being understood, not even being remembered correctly, just being the question that won't die. The boy in silk robes, the goddess in the river, the mirror Rome couldn't bear to look at. Elagabalus, remember him, and if you stayed this far, please subscribe to the channel and watch this video next about the most inbred man in European history.